Let's look at supply and demand first from the top down, thinking about all the things that we can do with it so that we can build up to the point of being able to make sense of the sorts of stories I've got here on the left side of my page. Now, just to give you that preview, what we're seeing here are two situations with a maximum price, where we're dealing with a price control, and how these situations have not just the dead weight loss that supply and demand requires must be there, but also a further story about why things are actually worse. In this case, we have a situation of misallocation. The price is low, and so we have some buyers who have a low value getting this good, while some buyers with a high value go without. Over here, it's only the high value buyers who get it, but they also end up wasting a lot of resources. So we're going to be able to make sense of why such things might happen by getting more comfortable with supply and demand. So our first place to start, very naturally, is to think about, for any given supply and demand, how do we find price? How do we find quantity? So we're going to think about that in sort of a conceptual way, and then move on to think about how we're going to do this sort of with more mathematical tools. So we've got that, and then with these new things, thinking about changing the underlying conditions. So for example, making a good more valuable will increase the demand, which will shift the demand curve. Adding taxes and subsidies is a very important application of the supply and demand model, understanding how things are going to change. And if we have a decent estimate of the shape of the supply and demand curves, the basic logic that we're going to go through here are going to let us make claims like, how costly is a tax? And for example, could we balance two different taxes to try to reduce how bad they are, right? This allows us to take our linear algebraic system and ask calculus questions with it. As we saw here, price control questions. Understanding the model itself is going to help us to think about how to translate what we can do with a graph into what we can do with algebra, which will allow us to take these sort of general predictions and give us precise predictions about exactly how big the dead weight loss should be for a given supply and demand system. And something we don't talk about very much anymore, quantity restrictions. Just for the sake of completeness, we'll take a look at that also. So once we're able to go through those different situations, we're able to ask some more interesting questions like, what happens to consumer surplus and producer surplus and total surplus, which is something we can do before we shift curves. But more importantly, we can ask about changing the total surplus when we go from some initial position to adding some scenario, right? So we can think about dead weight loss, but we might think about increased value if we do something that shifts the curves in a way that enhances efficiency. And we can ask questions about gaps, right? Gaps between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. And that'll give us some idea about how to make sense of this particular scenario, where we have people who can afford to buy this good. They can justify the expense based on their value for the good. But there's not enough to go around, and that leads to this misallocation story. So let's lay out our starting point. We've got our supply and demand graph as we normally draw it. Quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis, because that's just how we always do it. Might be more easy to wrap your head around the idea of you find a price and that determines the quantity, right? Thinking of price as the independent factor and quantity as the dependent factor. Doesn't really matter. Mathematically, we flip this backward or forward, it's going to be the same stuff, right? It's all going to work out, to the same prices, the same quantities, as long as we're careful and we are accounting for how things are set up. Doesn't matter, right? We're going to get to P star Q star, our equilibrium. We will be able to talk about what happens when we throw in a tax, how that affects quantity, how that affects the price to buyers, the price to sellers. We can think about what happens when we force the price to a different level. So maybe we put a minimum price up here. What's going to happen in that case? So that's the stuff that we're going to look like. And I guess the other thing that I'm forgetting here also is quantity restrictions. So what happens if we say put a maximum limit on the amount for sale at some Q bar, right? Or we require some minimum amount to be sold. What's going to happen in that case, and what's going to be required for such a situation to happen? And then with all that, we find where we end up, right? We find, say, with this required maximum, we're going to have to force the price down here to get that. So then we can ask questions about, well, what's going on with consumer surplus, this area over here? What's going on with producer surplus? Well, if they're selling at this low price, they're going to be making big losses. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to make this into a playlist. So I'm going to stop here and move on to the next ones in separate videos.